there is now a coup in Turkey. Now, this used to happen once a decade, but it hasn't happened in quite some time. The last one was in 1980. And this coup is unusual in two ways. First, you have to understand that coups in Turkey are not to end democracy normally. They are normally done to protect secular democracy. It's very unique. Normally a coup anywhere in the world is the military taking over, oftentimes leads to a strongman or a dictatorship. That is not the history in Turkey. In Turkey, usually if a government has exceeded its mandate, its power, or beyond the constitution, the military is a protector of secular democracy. They will step in and get rid of that government and then have orderly elections afterward. So that has been the history of coups in Turkey. Now, Erdogan is a right-winger. He is the president of Turkey, and he claims that he has won all these elections. So he says he's on the side of democracy. Now, some of those elections had great irregularities, such as a cat walking into a power outlet, which apparently knocked out 9 different cities' power. So some of these elections have stretched the bounds of reason, to say the least. So there is now a peace council. That is what the coup is calling itself. That is, they claim taken over the country. But that's the second incredibly unusual part of this coup. Normally, a coup happens fairly quickly. Not every time, but usually there's a decisive blow. They take over important things like the media outlets. And in this day and age, you can't take over the media outlets. As you'll see, Erdogan went on FaceTime to get his message out. We'll talk more about that in a second. But you take over the media, you take over important police installations and the airport, etc., and you finally get the person you are trying to do a coup on. Right now, it appears they do not have the president. The military that is doing the coup does not have the president. Furthermore, the military is divided. So normally it is a united military that does a coup. In this case, it is not. So it is not remotely over. And there is no resolution to this coup as we speak. We're doing this live. And this could stretch on quite some time. So I have sources from inside Turkey that are saying, and some of you have already seen this in the regular news outlets, that people are in the streets. Erdogan called them out into the streets. The fact that he called the people out shows you both good news and bad news for him. He does have a lot of supporters in the country. The country is split. Erdogan represents the more fundamentalist part of the country, and his opponents are more secular. So he's calling out the fundamentalist people. So some of them are shouting out Allahu Akbar as they climb on top of the military's tanks. So there's been shooting back and forth. John's going to give you some details about that. The police are generally on the side of Erdogan, the government. So now that means that the police and the military are often in conflict, and there are reports of shootouts there as well.
Yes. The Telegraph is reporting that 17 police officers have been killed. Obviously, they were killed by if that's true, they were killed by the military.
So one of my sources inside the country says that the military was trying to land in the most important police headquarters in Istanbul. The police shot back at the military. They claim that is what started the hostilities. Well, the coup started the hostilities, obviously, but in between the police and the military. Now there are reports that there are the tanks firing at the Parliament building.
Yeah,
now,
and a bomb being set off as well.
Right. So in the very beginning of this coup, a couple of hours ago, there was Turkish television was reporting it as not a coup, but a light military action. There is no such thing as a light coup. You either win or you all get executed. So now some portion of the Turkish military is either going to win or be executed.
Yeah.
And Erdogan is either going to win or going to walk out, presumably in handcuffs. So this is winner take all. And people are in the streets, the tanks are in the streets. This is a mess.
Yeah. And as you say, it's an interesting coup. It's a very modern coup because, as you said, in the past, you try to take over the media, and they did the version of that you normally do. They took over state television. That's how they began putting forth some of the statements that we're even going to read for you. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube were shut down almost instantly, but because of VPNs and things like that, satellite phones, all of that, there was still a lot of information that was coming out of the country. But we also have many journalists being ejected from the country, not by the military during the coup, but prior to the coup by Erdogan. So it's a very complicated situation in that way. some of what you said about controlling key areas was those were our initial clues that something was going on, because several important bridges had been blocked off by tanks. Eventually, the main Ankara airport was shut down. Now all airports are shut down. And because, as you said, this is not a unified military effort, it's actually far more dangerous, because you have not only the instance where the coup, the renegade helicopter, I guess that's the terminology we should use, fired upon the police station, killing 17 people. We then had a jet apparently affiliated with the military forces loyal to Erdogan shooting down one of those helicopters. We now have the potential for tank battles inside of these cities and armed forces on both sides fighting.
Well, when you get the military firing on police in the capital, that's a civil war. I mean, those are the things that begin a civil war.
Yeah.
So, look, if you are a believer in secular democracy, there is a reason to root for this coup. So I want to be clear about that. And I know that there are a lot of Turks inside the country now that are hoping that this gets done. If it does not get done and Erdogan regains power,
He'll have much more power than he ever had.
And he will be an immovable object. He will be guarded. He will pass every draconian law, and he will have every excuse to pass every draconian law to clamp down, and the fundamentalists will have a much tighter rein on power. So if you're in that secular group and you wanted the coup to succeed, it was good news in the beginning and not good news now. You wanted it to happen quickly and you wanted it to be over, but it is not over. Apparently one of the leading generals said that I'm not part of this, and he did not take sides. So there's a couple of different generals here. The Navy said, we are not part of this. Now, that doesn't mean that the Navy attacked the coup. You can see how this could devolve into an unbelievable mess. Yeah. Cops versus military, different parts of the military versus different parts of the military. And now...
as well, not to mention the fact the U.S. was very slow to really comment on this. Now the U.S. John Kerry's talked about it. Russia's made a few statements.
The president has talked about it too.
The president has talked about it as well. We have a base in Turkey, a base that houses nuclear weapons. So it's going to be interesting to see if we really do choose sides.
The president and John Kerry both. There's some really interesting stuff here. The president called on all parties to support the democratically elected government in Turkey. John Kerry said the president and secretary agreed that all parties in Turkey should support the democratically elected government of Turkey, show restraint, avoid any violence or bloodshed. This is from the State Department. The secretary underscored that the State Department will continue to focus on the safety and security of U.S. citizens in Turkey. Obviously, there's some question as a NATO member, what are you supposed to do when there's a coup attempt of one of your member states? It is a complicated situation, and I'm pretty sure the U.S. wants to side with the winner.
Yeah.
Let me.
So the U.S. role in this is very important and very unclear. Because, look, it is normal operating procedure. I'm not saying it happened in this case. I do not have any sources on that. But normally, if an ally like Turkey is going to pull off a coup against the government, they would certainly consult with the United States.
Right, and it appears they didn't. We don't know. This is too early. But
okay, I'm curious about your evidence on that. What is not evidence is Secretary Kerry or President Obama's words. They would say that they're backing the government no matter what they do.
They kind of have to.
So this is from Reuters. A senior EU source monitoring the situation said, quote, "It looks like a relatively well-orchestrated coup by a significant body of the military, not just a few colonels. They've got control of the airports and are expecting control over the TV station imminently. They control several strategic points in Istanbul. Given the scale of the operation," the source repeated, "it is difficult to imagine that they will stop short of prevailing. It's not just a few colonels," he repeated. This is 43 minutes ago. One European diplomat was dining with the Turkish ambassador to a European capital when guests were interrupted by the pinging of urgent news on their mobile phones. This is clearly not some tin pot little coup. The Turkish ambassador was clearly shocked and is taking it very seriously, the diplomat told Reuters as the dinner party broke up. However it looks in the morning, they will have massive implications for Turkey. This has not come out of nowhere, meaning it was planned. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, speaking jointly after talks in Moscow, said both hope bloodshed could be avoided. The U.S. State Department said Americans in Turkey should shelter indoors. So we still don't know.
There was a,
But that does, that suggestion that, again, that doesn't suggest that the U.S. didn't know, but it certainly suggests that it surprised a number of people who might have knowledge of it.
Yeah.
It would be, I would consider it shocking if the U.S. didn't know. And I'll give you more details of that in a second. And one of the top generals has been taken by the leaders of the coup. So there is definitely a rift within the Turkish military.
Yeah. So I guess, it's shocking and surprising because Turkey hasn't had a military coup since 1980. But if you really think about it, it's not that shocking, especially when you consider that Turkey, among all predominantly Muslim countries, has been, very vocal about remaining secular, right? So even though the country is divided among those who support Erdogan and those who, might agree with the military coup, I mean, there is this need and this want to be secular, right? But one thing that really stood out to me was how the first thing Erdogan wanted to do was ask his supporters to go out into the streets, right? And he has been so horrific toward journalists and protesters.
Yeah.
And so as soon as he needs protesters for his own agenda and his own purposes, he tells them to go out on the streets and risk their own lives.
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous for them to go out there. Obviously, we've been telling our own people not to. To what you were saying about the whether the U.S. might know or not, the statement that was put out by the coup forces, I think is interesting, both in terms of how they explain their motivation, but also their sort of reassurance to the U.S. They say Turkish armed forces have completely taken over the administration of the country to reinstate constitutional order, human rights and freedoms, the rule of law, and the general security that was damaged. All international agreements are still valid. We hope that all our good relationships with all countries will continue.
Yeah, there's no question what they want.
Yeah.
They want to be in charge of Turkey and get rid of Erdogan and continue the role that Turkey had prior to Erdogan. To Cenk's point, like whether the U.S. knew or not, we're not going to know in the coming days because, first of all, if we knew, it wasn't because these guys called John Kerry, because there's no question what side we have to be on, which is officially no, right? We don't support a coup against it. And that we have no bigger ally in the fight against ISIS than Turkey.
Yeah.
Incredibly valuable. So the notion that we would officially risk, because is what you just said, if it doesn't work and Erdogan that's the worst possible outcome for the United States, is a strengthened and empowered Erdogan. So the flip side is, to Cenk's point, the notion that the CIA didn't learn of this, that military contacts in Turkey who were involved didn't tell their military contacts either in NATO or with the United States, and that didn't, like this, whatever this is, it will be a fascinating, intriguing story when revealed.
So let me clarify, because this is not a normal situation. Erdogan referenced the CIA, but in a veiled way. So now Erdogan's not in charge. He claims he is, and he doesn't say everything is fine. That's why he asks his people to come out in the street. And Anna's absolutely right about the deep irony of him asking for protesters in the street. If you remember, one of the tactics that Erdogan's government used against protesters was fire water. They would put pepper spray in the water hoses and then spray that on everybody so that they'd get the pepper spray all over them. And the amazing images that came out of that. So he normally hates protesters in the streets. Now he's begging for protesters in the streets, which means he is not in charge. Yeah. And he has lost the media entirely, and he had great control over the media. He had a lot of the people that were in the media fired, imprisoned, but you can tell he's not in charge of the media because he had to use a cell phone and FaceTime a message to the Turkish people. No way Erdogan's FaceTiming a message to the Turkish people if he was actually in charge. So, look, if you're in favor of peaceful resolution, you want this to end either way immediately. Because the worst case scenario is neither side wins, and then we've got tanks all over the streets. You've got, one report has an F-16 Turkish military shooting down a Turkish military helicopter.
Yeah.
Oh boy. And
Turkey it's not out in the woods.
Turkey is heavily armed. It is the second largest army in NATO, second largest military in NATO. And if that military turns against itself, watch out. So now, let me give you what I know about the American involvement and the allegations back and forth. In his statement, Erdogan referenced Fethullah Gülen in Pennsylvania. He said this should not be run from Pennsylvania. Now, if you don't know what that means, you'd say, what? What in the world? What do you mean Pennsylvania? Well, there is another Muslim fundamentalist who lives inside America. His name is Fethullah Gulen. Now, he's an interesting character. He was deep allies with Erdogan. Erdogan's been in power since 2003, first as prime minister, then later as president. And they're both fundamentalist Muslims. Now, when I say that, understand that that's not fundamentalist Muslims as you would have in other places in the Middle East. As we have the Christian right here in America, they are basically the Muslim right. They are Republicans, right wing in that sense. I don't mean to throw, it's not about Republicans, Democrats.
Pence. He's the Mike Pence
Yes.
of Turkey.
So it's not like he's not a religious leader. Erdogan's not a religious leader, okay? But he is more of a Muslim fundamentalist within the democracy of Turkey. Now, again, people are unsure if he tainted that democracy in those elections.
Yeah.
So Gulen is a religious leader and used to work with Erdogan. There is very good reason to believe that Gulen has an alliance with the CIA. Now, he has a compound in Pennsylvania. He has charter schools all over America. We don't often give fundamentalist Muslims charter schools to teach a lot of our kids here in America, and he has a ton in Texas, for example, unless you've got some sort of okay from the U.S. government. And now...
I don't know why you'd say that.
Now, when Erdogan and Gulen then broke apart and began an internal struggle for power in Turkey, a lot of the police used to be on Gülen's side. And then Erdogan came in with a power play, cleaned that out. The judges used to be on Gülen's side. Some of them were. And now Erdogan cleaned them out, has the judges on his side. It is an amazing power play going on. And at that break, it appears that the American government thought Erdogan's off the reservation. So there are things that happen behind the scenes. And the United States was very happy with Erdogan. When the break happened, they were no longer happy with Erdogan, and it appeared that behind the scenes, the U.S. was on Gülen's side. So now, Gulen put out a statement saying, oh, it wasn't me. I'm just hanging out in Pennsylvania eating cheesesteaks. I don't know what you guys are talking about. I didn't do it. Obviously, Erdogan's claiming that he did. So it would be enormously surprising if a military, obviously very well organized, not as organized as they want to be, but they've closed down the airports, the bridges. They obviously plotted this to a very large degree. That kind of military coup didn't ask the CIA, didn't ask Gulen, who is an enormous power base in Turkey, did not ask the American government. Now, Ben is right. The American government would never say it publicly. Never. Because what if the coup doesn't work? Then our relationship with one of our top allies would be deeply poisoned. Poisoned beyond what we already know is happening behind the scenes. It would be out in front. And then how are we going to launch our planes from Turkey to fight ISIS? We won't be able to. So this has implications for Turkey, for the Middle East, and for the whole world. And if I had to guess, and I am guessing because I don't know, I don't have any memos that says, yes, Cenk, the CIA ordered this coup, or is in cahoots with the coup. I'm telling you what would normally happen. If I had to guess, I would say that we were on the side of the coup, the U.S. is. And so if it does not work, it's certainly Erdogan will think that we were on the side of the coup, and we will have a lot of trouble.
And he'll say it and make Turks believe it, whether it's true or not.
And he's already said it.
You
don't
paranoid.
say this is being led by a man in Pennsylvania if you aren't accusing the CIA.
So what's interesting
He's
is
talking
that,
about Santorum.
is that obviously the United States has to react to it, and there's only a limited number of ways you can publicly react to it. But nonetheless, what we're hearing is that Obama, as you would imagine, had a meeting in the last few hours with his national security staff, and then they came out with that statement, meaning that maybe what they heard in that meeting was, this is wild speculation, that not working.
Mm-hmm. Well, right now,
because they are assuring the Turkish what they assured the Turkish ambassador, or what Kerry assured the Turkish foreign minister, whose name I can't begin to say, Cavusoglu. Oh, look, I got it.
Okay,
I nailed it. Absolute support for Turkey's democratically elected civilian government and democratic institutions. But then again, you don't know whether is it possible the foreign minister is part of the coup? Everything's possible.
Anything is possible at this point. I mean, it's a coup.
It's a coup, yeah.
So there are three different ways that this can end. The coup continues. They manage to wrangle enough of the rest of the military and the police and keep the people in the streets at bay, and they seize power. And it happens relatively quickly.
Yeah.
By the morning, by the next day, it's over. A second possibility is the coup deteriorates, and now there are some reports that it is, and the other parts of the military step in along with the police and crush the coup. The third possibility is neither side wins. That is probably the worst case scenario. So now, look, I'm deeply secular, so my proclivities are obvious. But if the Turkish military and police start fighting one another and it does not end, if you thought the Middle East and that region was unstable before, you ain't seen nothing yet.